Hello, I'm Dick Clay. I'm the president of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Gertrude Polk Brown Lecture Series, tonight featuring author David Michaelis in his latest book, Eleanor. This lecture series was initiated in 1993 as a memorial to the life of Gertrude Polk Brown, and made possible by the continuous generous support of her family, her daughter, Dace Brown Stubbs, her grandson, G. Garvin Brown IV, her daughter, Laura Lee Brown, and her grandchildren, Garvin Dieters, Laura Lee Gastus, and Polk Dieters. The series has brought internationally recognized historians to Louisville. More than 37,000 citizens, including the 541 of you who've registered for tonight, have learned more about the significant stories of our region, our nation, and our world because of the Gertrude Polk Brown lectures. The Filson is extraordinarily grateful for this generosity. It is our signature program. I'm now honored to introduce David Michaelis as our Gertrude Polk Brown speaker. David Michaelis grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., was educated at Concord Academy and Princeton University, and is the author of 6 books, including the national bestsellers N.C. Wyeth, which won the 1999 Ambassador Book Award for biography, and Schultz and Peanuts, a National Book Critics Circle Best Recommended Book. Now it is indeed my pleasure to turn the program over to David Michaelis. David, welcome to the Filson, welcome to Louisville, welcome to Kentucky.
Thank you so much, Dick. I'm genuinely honored to be tonight's and this year's Gertrude Polk Brown speaker. And I want to thank the Filson and the Brown family, the magnificent Browns, and their Aunt Trudy. And say that I've always heard of the Filson and always wanted to go in and be in there. So this is a little like getting, I don't know, tapped for Skull and Bones or something like that, and then not being able to go into the crypt. But we're going to persevere just the way Eleanor would. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Eleanor Roosevelt was a great noticer. She went everywhere, and everywhere she went, she noticed everything and everyone. The individual, the person, the man in the street, everyone she met, every individual was a person from whom she felt she could learn something, gain something, be opened by. And during the Depression, when she was First Lady of the United States and the longest serving First Lady of our United States, the individual and the devaluation of the individual was the great lesson. And people suffered. And Eleanor, who had suffered in her own life, she wrote to a friend at one point during the 30s, "I felt obliged to notice everything." And really her greatness was in her response to suffering and to the suffering of individuals. But her sympathy, which was great, and her empathy, which was even greater, is not really the story of my book. The story of my book is how she lived her own pain, how she grew through what she went through, and how she used each individual's suffering to figure out a solution, to find some way to ameliorate or even end the suffering of many, many others. Eleanor's everywhereness, her travels, constantly actually, well, I should say occasionally, brought her to Louisville. And there she dropped in on her travels and stayed when she came to Louisville with her friends Mary and Barry Bingham, and she loved the 8-mile drive out River Road. She loved the sense of woodlands as the car came up in Glenview, came up to the house that was filled with 5 children, exactly as her house was. And she particularly loved the glimpses one had of the river and of river life. She was a river person all her life. And I think she felt very much at home in Glenview. One day there, and the reason I'm telling this story and bringing Glenview into this is one day there as she was taping something and sitting on the sofa. As soon as the taping was finished, her glance dropped to the floor where she noticed a piece of paper. And she wrote the next day about this moment. This is very typical of Eleanor's noticing. It would always be a small moment in her day. And now she shared this moment with about, well, several million readers in 100 newspapers on May the 1st, 1954, where she said, looking down, I noticed a paper on the floor of the sofa, under the sofa. I drew it out and found a most spirited drawing, which could almost be used as a frieze, as it had several pictures of horses, all of them in motion. They were drawn by the 7-year-old daughter whose name is Eleanor, like mine. I wish I could have kept them to show my own 7-year-old grandchildren, for the horses had real life in them. So I partially dedicate this Gertrude Pope Brown lecture to Eleanor Bingham Miller, now all grown up, but no less spirited, and also sharing that dedication, Barry Bingham Jr., the late Barry Bingham Jr., who predicted years and years ago, and quite often, that we would all be communicating exactly this way someday. Barry, it all came true. On we go to one of the childhoods from hell. Eleanor Roosevelt was born in New York City to parents who really had no more business being parents, or no more intention of being parents than what they were, which was Elliott Roosevelt, one of the old families of New York City, was a sportsman, and his older brother Theodore Roosevelt had entered Republican politics by the time Eleanor came along in 1884, and he too felt he should do something, but he still wasn't sure what, and he never, sadly, ever really figured it out. And his addictions, his dependence on alcohol, it spiraled him very early in Eleanor's life into a continual series of cures, sanitariums. Eleanor's mother, meanwhile, Anna Rebecca Hall Roosevelt, was, as Eleanor was born, declared the second most beautiful woman in New York, the first being Mrs. Astor, because the first had to be Mrs. Astor, because the Astors were still the Astors of New York. And this really meant Anna Roosevelt Hall was the most beautiful woman in New York, and she wanted it to stay that way. She also was, the Halls were an old family from old New York, from the old Edith Wharton, old New York, and she was already feeling the pull downward as the greater fortunes rose, the Vanderbilts and the railroad fortunes and Mr. Morgan and the entire Gotham city of the Industrial Revolution was not as hospitable to families like the Halls. Think of the magnificent Ambersons and how they came down in the world. This was what was happening with the Halls. Consequently, as on the margins, but still fighting to get to the top of the social heap as one of the great social leaders, Anna Hall saw anything that was old or stern or stodgy as what she did not want. And her daughter, although this photograph here is the bright Eleanor, the bright smiling Eleanor, showing the first signs of two very famous, one day to be famous front teeth, was usually very stern and very, with her father especially. And she was called by her mother when she was in one of her moods, one of her quiet or withdrawn moods. She was called Granny. And her mother was a great humiliator, shamer, and her father was just the opposite. He adored Eleanor. And yet with his constant plunges, rising up and then plunging back down in cycles all the way through Eleanor's childhood, he was very much there for her and yet made her into what you can see in a Dickens character like Little Nell. Elliot Roosevelt was actually called Nell, and they actually nicknamed Eleanor Little Nell. And Eleanor always called the photograph on the left a photograph of Little Nell admonishing Big Nell. She would look after her father. She was actually, in a way, almost more wife than daughter. And as you saw in the picture just before, she was almost more older woman. She almost was a granny as a child. Whereas as an older woman, although this photograph doesn't quite do the dazzling Eleanor Roosevelt of later years the justice I'd like it to, but it does carry forward her stern admonishing finger. It is a moment, I mean, it is a reminder that as Eleanor was an older woman, she actually was very youthful and was very free. As a young woman, she was very stern, and she was the older, sort of wiser child who should, who tells others what they should know. With the deaths of her parents and of a younger brother by the age of 10, her father died her mother died first, of diphtheria, and her father died of addiction, of alcoholism, and threw himself from the third-story window of a house on 103rd Street. And with that, Eleanor was orphaned with one younger brother still, Hall Roosevelt, and they went to live with their grandmother. You see her here. And Grandmother Hall was sort of in control of this old house on the Hudson. They also had a house in the city, but this was the house on the left that Eleanor really grew up in. And she had, in fact, quite fond memories of, because her aunts and uncles were still, as she first arrived there, in states. Below left is a magnificent Amberson still, just to show a kind of sense of, this was that moment where an old family was coming down, but still hanging on and still pretty damn charming. And Eleanor loved her aunts and uncles. She loved the gaiety of the house when they had friends there. It also required her to be a grown-up in ways that they weren't required to be grown-ups. And Grandmother Hall really was one of the great enablers of all time, because as her sons who were serious alcoholics and became transformed from the tennis champions of 1880, literally Eddie and Valley Hall were literally the 1880, 1881 doubles champions of the United States, bringing home, great huge silver cups. And yet then they were in their cups. And off Eleanor went, thank heavens, escaping a great deal of trauma well, we'll go back to that, but she went to England, where she was following in the footsteps of her Roosevelt aunt, Bammy Roosevelt, who had been chosen as Marie Souvestre, the great educator. You see her below in the right-hand corner, teaching the girls in her study. You would not have, you would recognize Marie Souvestre today as a sort of an actress or a great character, a great personality. She was also lesbian. She had lovers, and she had the absolute awe and respect of English society, and of sort of cultivated English society, and of the continent, of continental families who sent their daughters there. Eleanor immediately took to Allenswood. It was unlike anything she had been involved in before, because she was finally a very popular girl. She was having been alienated and lonely and cast aside by all the trauma of her early childhood. She now was in charge of her peers. She spoke better French than anyone else in the school. She was the go-between, Madame Souvestre, sort of chosen go-between between Madame and the other girls and their needs as international students. And she had 3 years there that were some of the best years of her life. Madame Souvestre's principle, her great precept was use your brain, use your mind. This was a moment, this is about 1901, 1902. And this is a time in which women's education was still viewed as very dangerous, potentially dangerous to the mental health of women. I mean, this was the moment, just for a parallel timeline, in Kentucky, where the Kentucky legislature had just repealed the right of women to vote. And then on would go the fight up to suffrage in 1920. But Eleanor's life changed because she was now being encouraged to use her mind, to notice everything, to be a noticer, to be an intermediary. And it's the great thing of, it's a great way of understanding Eleanor's role in the world for many years to come. She was able to go between an older, very eccentric woman like Madame Souvestre and her young peers. She was able to go between Aunt Pussy, you see Aunt Pussy in the upper right-hand corner, and her grandmother, or she was the one who, when Uncle Valley and Uncle Eddie were thrown into, literally thrown into jail in the city on another bender in the Tenderloin, Eleanor was the one who was called in to do the business of going into the station house to talk to, Desk Sergeant Mulroney, because none of these women, none of these fancy patrician Hudson Valley bracketed women could have spoken a word to Sergeant Mulroney. Eleanor could, and she did. And this is why when she came back to the United States in 2001, unfortunately to become a debutante, fortunately, the Junior League of New York had just begun, had just joined the settlement movement, which had begun in Chicago and at Hull House with Jane Addams, and earlier in England. And the American version, down on Rivington Street in Manhattan, Eleanor began going down 2 and 3 times a week on her own, an extraordinary thing for a young woman like Eleanor, to teach the children of young Italian immigrants, newly arrived Italians with young children who didn't know how to move, didn't know what to say, didn't know how to dress, were uncomfortable even being in a room with a woman like Eleanor. She taught calisthenics, she taught dance, and she taught them how to kind of feel good about themselves being in this new country. And she interpreted America, and having been in Italy with Madame Souvestre, she knew how protective Italian mothers were. And so she knew that she was the one who had to tell the young girls certain things about life in America that their mothers were not going to ever let them do. At this moment, 1902, on a train going north, she met her cousin, whom she had actually seen once before when he trotted her around their nursery when she was 4 and he was 8. Their parents were friends. Eleanor's father was Franklin's godfather. Elliott Roosevelt was Franklin's godfather. And Franklin's mother was known to and close friends with Theodore Roosevelt and Bamie Roosevelt, although she didn't think much of the Oyster Bay tribe. You see Sarah Delano Roosevelt up in their upper right corner, and more on her in a moment. But Franklin and Eleanor, I mean, what attracted these two to each other? They would seem, well, you know what they seem to be. Everyone has a very good preconception of Franklin being the glamorous, handsome, young, sort of arrow collar man, and Eleanor, it's sort of homely, plain, shy, not yet quite schoolmarmish, but fairly schoolmarmish. And so why would they ever get together? Well, the fact is, you have to remember that the girl on the right here, the young woman on the right here, is right now the daughter of the President of the the niece of the President of the United States, and not just the President of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt was something new under the sun, something new in the world. And the glamour that attached to Theodore Roosevelt, which Franklin, his 5th cousin, as Eleanor was his 5th cousin, these were both fifth cousins looking into each other's eyes here on the porch at Campobello, was smitten as much by Theodore Roosevelt as he was by Eleanor Roosevelt, who he was genuinely smitten by. I would say what attracted them, or what made their bond originally, and there's reasons on Eleanor's side also for joining forces with the far more settled, secure, and really stable Franklin and Sarah in the unstable world she was living in. She really had no home. I mean, she had no address. She was nowhere. She had nowhere and nowhere to go exactly. Her aunts and uncles were a mess and getting worse. And so, of course, there was that reason. But the two of these people were oddballs. And that's really, it's sort of a compact of oddballs. Franklin, when he had gone off to Groton at 13, was considered by his peers really just, they They called him a golden retriever because he was so eager, because he was so out of place, always jumping up, trying to get people to do things. Eleanor was an oddball because she was out of the loop of every loop. Her father's death had been a scandal. Her mother's death had left her with no sense of how to connect with other women, and except for older women, and Eleanor actually very much connected with Franklin's mother because Marie Sylvestre, because of her aunts, because of Grandmother Hall. She knew how to connect with an old, but she did not know how to connect with her peers. So that was one of their really early attractions, except the marriage itself, the romance, the love of Franklin Delano Roosevelt immediately hit its first of many roadblocks. And really the honeymoon, and this is Franklin in Rome and Eleanor also in the garden in Rome. They right away discovered that they had struggles loving each other. Eleanor had trouble being playful. Franklin had trouble taking Eleanor seriously and taking her need for the truth seriously. He teased her by flirting with other women. He always wanted to do things his way. He was a great charmer. He always knew how to make her feel better, but he never really knew how to make her feel like the most wonderful woman, the most beautiful woman in the world. And their honeymoon was great ups and downs. And I think also really what needs to be remembered is that his ambition already was set. I mean, he felt marked for greatness, and she simply felt marked. And that really separated them for a long time. Eleanor, when they returned, had what seemed like sickness, and she hated those transoceanic trips because of trauma from her own childhood on an ocean liner. And so they thought she was just simply seasick when she returned, but it turned out she was pregnant. She had her first child in May, and the person at her side as she delivered her first baby in May 6, 1904, was not her mother-in-law, who was downstairs with Franklin, and obviously not her own mother, who was now, it was, she was 10 years gone, and yes, 10 years gone. And so the woman on the lower, in the lower photograph in the middle, Nurse Spring, Blanche Spring, sorry, a lovely young woman from a young nurse, trained nurse from Maine, whose father had made a killing in wool in Argentina, and who was nursing out of her own sort of devotion. And Eleanor immediately fell for this Blanche Spring, and Blanche reappeared at every one of her 6 births and remained during babies, and was one of Eleanor's first real connections to an older woman, a surrogate mother who was sort of healthy and positive and wonderful, and taught her how to, do all the things that no one had taught her, and no one kind of would have taught her, and everyone expected her simply to know. And so Blanche Spring was one of the great figures of Eleanor's early motherhood, which was otherwise extremely stressful. And I'll only say that everybody who's a parent will remember how they were in the early days with a child, where you'd hear in the middle of the night the cry, and you'd rush to the crib and you'd do something. You'd pick the child up, you do this, you do that, you do what to expect when you're expecting, or T. Barry Brazelton had told you to do. If Eleanor heard a cry in the middle of the night, as she got to the crib, there already was a nurse, not Nurse Spring, another nurse hired by her mother-in-law, already there, and who was already dosing that child with castor oil per Mama, that is to say, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, Franklin's mother's instructions. Mama was in charge. She was in charge of the house. She was in charge of the houses, how to decorate, how the decorations, even where the flowers were placed on certain tables. Mama was in charge of everything to do with the children, and Eleanor acquiesced, partly out of a sense of inferiority or simply trying to catch up to something she never would catch up to. She couldn't bring herself to understand that she herself was lovable. And that's another story which we'll pick up in a minute. In the war, in the advent of World War II, when Franklin, by then, they had lived in Washington now, and they now had 5 children. They had lost one, very tragically, Eleanor's third child, a son. The first Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., they had lost him to illness and to not to neglect, but simply something she never forgave herself for, that she hadn't been with him at the moment he died. And Eleanor's grief about that child was unending. She struggled as a new political wife in Washington, but mastered her life as the wife of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And Franklin, when the war came, was all in, saber rattling, and couldn't wait for America to get into Europe's Great War. He knew that's where history was going to be made. And he even said at that moment, my gosh, what wouldn't it be great to be a war president? He knew where power lay, and he knew that's what he wanted. Eleanor was a little more confused, but she said at the end of the war, World War I was my great education. And the reason why is that when she went to the meeting at Rauscher's, the place in Washington, D.C., where young women like herself all had gathered to try to figure out what they could do, they all discovered, guess what? None of them knew how to do anything, in the sense, no one knew how to drive a car. No one had a license, of course. There was nothing like a, they didn't know how to type. They didn't know how, no one had taught these women how to do anything except be what women were supposed to be, which was second best in a man's world, and not really anything but mothers and helpmeets and all the rest of that. Eleanor was very determined, let's not forget, she was a Roosevelt, to do something in the war beyond simply the greatness of, which turned out to be great, of knitting, because knitting was something that actually became a nationwide passion, craze, and war effort on the part of women. But she wanted, like her cousin Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s wife, Eleanor Alexander Roosevelt, known as Theodore Eleanor, as Eleanor was known as Franklin Eleanor. Boy, does that sound like the Handmaid's Tale. But Eleanor Alexander Roosevelt was at the front line. She had gotten herself almost illegally, actually, through the YMCA to the front line and was serving on the front lines as a nurse, etc. Eleanor wished she could be there. She had a opening she discovered at the Washington Union Station canteen, and there she flourished. She worked her way up the ranks, and you can see one of the canteen workers down on the left. They would hand out coffee and buns to the soldiers going through. In that position, Eleanor both became a great administrator, and she saw men, hundreds, men by the thousands, men by the tens of thousands on trains coming from the South up through Washington, going to the railheads at Newport News, embarking. Men who'd never seen the sea were now going overseas over there to bring, to make the world safe for democracy. This was something that struck her very powerfully. She felt a sense of what her father's life might have been like had he grown out of his endless sort of boyhood. And when the troops came home at the end of the war, Eleanor was right there again in a role that really defines her. There's a photograph here of a young African-American widow. An African-American widow suffered terribly because America had not yet been able, and President Wilson was making one of the great mistakes by not honoring African-American veterans in the many ways they should. And in fact, violence and worse was beginning to be visited on returning African-American electors as Jim Crow closed in again over this world that was supposed to have been made safe for democracy, but was actually just simply being made safe for white supremacy and lynching. And Eleanor's job at that time as wife of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy was to go to Arlington when naval men were buried there, when families, there were so many coffins, so many military funerals to arrange, that they were backlogged. And she would go out and stand and bear witness in the way that Lady Liberty did in this Honor of the Brave etching you see below. She was the one who stood when no family was there, when a young man, a fallen soldier's coffin was lowered into the earth at Arlington. Eleanor's duty took her also to St. Elizabeth's, where she discovered her own fears of sanitarium that had been really a kind of almost a PTSD-like effect had taken place because of her many visits to her father when he went crazy and when he was locked into sanitaria in Europe. This all reminded her of that. Some of the young men reminded her, and they were suffering, as the young man above right is showing, something new called shell shock. And the men on the left are being given something called hydrotherapy, where they're turned into sort of human burritos in order to calm them after and during episodes of shell shock. Eleanor forced herself, and it was one of the moments where you see Eleanor Roosevelt of the future defining herself by forcing herself to remain in locked wards, talking herself through it, knowing only the next day, only the next time she visited, that she was now a little stronger from having overcome the fear that she had thought was going to just make it impossible for her to stay in the room and in the job. Right at the same time, when it rains, it pours, Eleanor came across letters when Franklin returned from one of his visits as Assistant Secretary to Europe. And on the boat coming back, he caught the new Spanish flu and was suffering so much when he got off the boat that he had to be ambulanced home. While he was in bed, Eleanor unpacked his belongings, found letters which revealed that he was in love with and had been for 2 years in love with Eleanor's social secretary, Lucy Page Mercer, who was a social equal in the sense that she came from an old Maryland family and was a very elegant, lovely person. Eleanor had liked Lucy very, very much. The children adored her. And Franklin, who in his big butterscotch voice would say, "Ah, the lovely Lucy," whenever she would come into the house, had fallen in love with her. It created, of course, a sense for Eleanor that the world had once again fallen away and out from under her, as when her father had died, as when men in general disappointed her, and most specifically, the man that she thought loved her more than any other had now given his heart away. She was very practical in certain ways about her responses to it. But I'm really of the mind and belief that hang on one sec, that her responses to, yeah, it's right there. I'm sorry, I was looking for the photograph of Franklin. That Eleanor's responses to Lucy, which was to offer Franklin a divorce, and then to realize very methodically and philosophically that there were things she wasn't going to ever be able to do for Franklin, and that a man is what a man is in her words, and that she could only do so much. She was tested again in the same way, in a different way, when Franklin contracted polio 3 summers later. I'm skipping over one important thing, which was that she alone in her household, right following the Lucy Mercer event, when they had recommitted staying together, even though they would not divorce. It was Eleanor, the Spanish flu now was heavy in Washington. The pandemic had reached Washington and the virus was going around. Everybody in the Roosevelt household except Eleanor was struck. And we can all think of her now much more clearly going around and taking care of everyone, even out to soldiers' barracks where the virus was out of control, with clothing, with books, with baskets. Typical Eleanor, putting aside her own health to help others. She looked upon Franklin's illness with horror when he contracted polio, as did Louis Howe. And in the first week and 2 and 3 weeks in Campobello's story, we all know pretty well, she was in every way part of his immediate existential survival. He really thought he was not going to survive, and he also felt abandoned by God. He was very deeply, Franklin was very deeply faithful in one sense, that he thought God had chosen him to do great things. And it was the thing he actually clung to through it all, as did Eleanor. But their choices about how they would move forward really told a great deal about what their marriage and their partnership as a political pair would become. And for Eleanor, it was realizing that she could choose to become the representative of the family in public, in politics, as women's suffrage, as women got the right to vote, as women became the next new force in politics. Eleanor and her friends, you see here Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman. Marion had been one of the earliest female nominees for a congressional race in New York State. She joined these friends, these new friends she made, by going out and overcoming her fear of speaking. Eleanor was of the generation that was told they would never speak in public. She was convinced she never would, the kind of thing where, the same sort of thing, you appear in the papers 3 times when you're born, when you marry, and when you die, certainly not every day. And Eleanor began appearing in the newspapers and praised as a new woman organizer in democratic politics. Really what's going on, however, is Eleanor was making decisions about how she and Franklin would move forward. And it was in parallel universes side by side, a sort of cottage colony on the left when Eleanor and her friends began living in a place called Valkill, which was right near the Roosevelt property. In fact, Franklin owned the land, and it was he who deeded it to the three women who were in a sort of wonderful cottage partnership of politics and romance. Marion and Nan were a couple. Eleanor was sort of the odd woman out, and not yet, I think, involved with them in a sexual or erotic way. But she was very close to them as intimates because they were really kind of teaching her how to be a woman as an adult in ways she had not been. And in the small little arguments about householding and the big dramas they would have, Eleanor was beginning to learn how to be a real person in ways that she couldn't even begin to be in a home with Franklin and his mother and their children that she really felt never belonged to her. What she did do was, as Franklin made new relationships, she embraced them. And she embraced, as you see, every single one of Franklin's amanuenses, the women who helped him become the Franklin Roosevelt of the 1920s on a houseboat. He had every single opportunity still for office if he could walk again, and that's what he set out to do. Eleanor realized right away that she, I'm not sure why it's making those. Eleanor realized right away that she was going to be Franklin's partner, and as she took on the Al Smith campaign, as she became a powerhouse in Democratic politics, it was she who really lured him back and made clear, it was so clear to her that for Franklin to be Franklin, for Franklin Roosevelt ever to be who he would be, he would have to be in politics regardless. And it was she who put him on the phone literally to Al Smith and said, you've got to emerge from Warm Springs and from your therapy and begin to start exercising in public and showing what you can do. And he ran for governor, and although Smith lost, of course he won, and on they went to the State House, where Eleanor took over as First Lady with all these different jobs as she was sort of caricatured as, you know, now that she was now beginning to be seen as the sort of super woman and power listener, power female executive. On the right, Franklin is getting the telegram from Herbert Hoover, which came at the climax of the night in November 1932, November 5th, 1932. He was now President of the United States, and Eleanor, of course, was horrified. She would have to go back to all the things that she had left behind as she became a politician in her own right. She knew what the job was of First Lady, and she did an extraordinary job with it. And she brought, well, we'll see what she brought in a second, but in the event of the greatest depression that the United States had gone through, and the greatest crisis since the Civil War, and the Roosevelts taking control from a White House that had been completely cut off from people, and completely cut off from the people. Herbert Hoover ran an impregnable executive. It would be the equivalent today of, trying to get the chairman of Verizon on the phone to talk about your phone bill. That's kind of what it would have been like trying to get Herbert Hoover to respond to something. Franklin Roosevelt, when he got into office, made people think, yeah, he was interested in your phone bill, and he would talk to you about it. And you know who would? Eleanor. The people came to the president to talk about their phone bills, but Eleanor went to you, and she brought herself to people in a way and mobilized the First Lady and put the First Lady on wheels and into the air. And she herself was going through a transformation because she had fallen in love. And a lot to talk about with Eleanor's sexuality and adaptability in sexuality, because it's confusing. And it was so confusing when I began research in 2009 that the function on Google search where you would say, is George Washington, and the next most used word would pop up and it would say alive, is George Washington alive, would be the question being asked that moment in America. With Eleanor Roosevelt, if you typed in, is Eleanor Roosevelt, the next most often asked word at the time in 2009 was gay. People just didn't understand, because there had been a groundbreaking biography full of accurate and extremely useful and extremely fortunate research by Blanche Wiesen Cook, which showed that Eleanor Roosevelt's relationship with Lorena Hickok, this AP reporter, dynamic AP reporter, wrote front page stories, had covered the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, had covered, you know, everything, was everywhere like Eleanor, and had been in several romances with women that had been the loves of her life. She was absolutely smitten by Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor began to be very taken by her. And when things began to get pretty hot and heavy, their letters reflected. And if you sat down, I guarantee you, and the letters were there in the Filson Historical Society, as they are, copies of them are at Hyde Park, you would come most likely to a conclusion that these two people absolutely adored and desired and wanted each other. And Eleanor, as she came into the White House and had a great deal of doubts about enormous numbers of things, and as they entered the House that day after the inaugural parade, at Franklin on his mother's arm and Eleanor trailing behind, she looked down at the ring on her finger, and it was not that ring you saw earlier, the engagement, sparkling diamond engagement ring that she had actually had to hide from her mother-in-law. It was a blue sapphire that her new love, Lorena Hickok, had given her, and it's what gave her great courage. And she wrote to Lorena that night, kissed her photograph before going to sleep in her room in the southwest corner of the White House, and began not just being First Lady of the United States at the most horrific time in our history besides the Civil War, but she was in love. And very soon found her voice. This is Eleanor Roosevelt visiting the second bonus March Army, men who were not being paid what they were been promised by their government. The First Army had been shot upon and fired and cannonaded, and their tents set afire by other American servicemen, other American Army troops. Hoover had called out General MacArthur along with the young Major Eisenhower, and they had stormed across Anacostia River, and they had thrown the bonus army out of Washington, and they had torched what was left. The Second Army came again, and FDR, actually Louis Howe, brought Eleanor out and said, go on in and talk to the men. And she had no idea what to say or even what she would do. And by the time she got in there, what's happening right there is she's introducing herself. And within about 10 minutes, she was singing songs of the First World War that she remembered from her time at the canteen, and the men loved her. And the next day, the headlines in the papers in Washington were the quote from one of the men who said, Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife. She was a hit. People loved her. She went everywhere. She made, she sort of did what Otis did for the elevator. She went up. She went into the air. She went down into the mines. She wrote a column. She was in your newspaper talking to you just like a neighbor. She was on the radio. She was in the newsreels. She waved to you from newsreels in a way that very few people ever saw. You know, a woman, there weren't women doing this kind of thing. And in fact, the women hated her for the most part in the beginning. She was much beloved in a certain way after a certain point. I would say that point was 1939, but by 1936, she was also a pretty big hit when FDR was reelected. She brought African-American women into the party. She had done things for aviation and other American industries. Here you see Katharine Hepburn in Women of the Year imitating Eleanor Roosevelt, and Hollywood is directly imitating an ad that Eleanor did there. The point of Eleanor in the Air is that I think during the Depression, if you were in a town in America and you heard a plane overhead and you read in the paper that that was the First Lady of the United States, no First Lady, of course, had ever been in the air, much less traversing the United States as she was in May 1933, you kind of thought to yourself, you know, if Eleanor Roosevelt is up there and she's flying to California, well, by God, things happen. And I may not get up there or do that, but I can do something, and I can do things, and things are happening again. And Eleanor's sense, I think, it's a long, slow walk from her childhood in a primarily Southern family on her father's side, and its relationship to African Americans, to her relationship with African Americans as First Lady, which was to bring as much forward of the struggle and of the new agenda of African women in education. This is Mary McLeod Bethune, the great educator who had joined FDR's black cabinet, so-called, and was doing things that Eleanor could facilitate and Eleanor could help with. She was still in a role where she would try to say, don't move too fast, don't do things too quickly. And that included things like Marian Anderson being banned from the Constitution Hall, which was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution, on the basis of the fact that she was black. And so they said, no, you can't give your concert here. Eleanor was furious. She resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution, which she was a member of because of her Livingston family relatives. And she arranged with Ickes, Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, to use the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to give Marian Anderson a chance to sing. The crowd stretched far down the reflecting pool. It became the first civil rights meeting, march, was how it was seen or called at the time. People were aware suddenly of struggles like this because Eleanor popularized them. The strange, odd footnote to this picture and to the day itself was that Eleanor wasn't there. This is sort of typical of a lot of things in the Eleanor Roosevelt history, which is that you'd have expect Eleanor might have even been there to introduce Marian Anderson, but in fact, that was Secretary Ickes, who did an extraordinarily good job, actually. Eleanor was home. It was Easter Sunday. She was up the Hudson River with her family, with the president, where she had to be. But this is so often how we remember and misremember things. Eleanor was literally the butt of every joke and a lot of hatred. So much hatred, it's kind of put the last 4 years into perspective in different ways. There's a charming Hirschfeld there of Eleanor, caricaturing Eleanor everywhere with train timetables in the background. A quite horrible, nasty, terrible white supremacist Southern American Liberty League caricature of Eleanor, as the so-called queen of Greater Liberia. Horrors like that, and that's a very nice one, to be honest with you, occurred every day. And then Eleanor, of course, with Franklin winning a fourth term and becoming a participant for the first time in the government itself. She was co-director with Fiorello LaGuardia of the Office of Civil Defense, a new wing of the new government agency, and off she went, but not before, as Pearl Harbor was bombed, being the first voice on her radio program to address Americans on December 7th, 1941. The next day, FDR did declare it a date which will live in infamy and gave his declaration of war before joint session, but it was Eleanor's voice that reached Americans first, and she gave people the real information. She told them how widespread. It wasn't just Pearl Harbor, it was Guam, it was the Philippines, it was all across the Pacific. She had been at the forefront of preparations for mobilization. They had been fighting America Firsters, they had been fighting Charles Lindbergh, they had been fighting isolationists. It was finally time to wake up to reality, people, and get with it. What she did was she did it in a way where she said, I believe in you and I believe in the strength of Americans to get through this. I know you're all scared, we're all scared, but we have the strength. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States. She went on an 18-island tour to the war zone, and this I'm just going to show simply as a visitor to hospitals. There was no one greater than Eleanor, and she had learned a great deal from Mrs. Edith Wilson during the First World War. How do you look at a man in a hospital bed? How do you look him in the face when he has no face? Edith Wilson taught her how. She learned her own ways of doing this. And here, what she's doing is she went to every bed, and Admiral Halsey, and they were all floored what she did, because she made these men feel not just that she was, they would wait and expect Betty Grable to get off the plane, and it would be Mrs. Roosevelt in a grass skirt, and they loved her even more. And they loved her because she came to their bedsides. She knew their towns. She'd been everywhere, and she took back to their wives and girlfriends and mothers messages and literally made those phone calls herself. Here she is taking a photograph. A photograph is being taken with sort of Life magazine guy on the left. A horrible wound, a horrible dismemberment, but it's still looking pretty Life magazine. On the right, however, Eleanor Roosevelt is going and meeting with the Japanese American soldier. The army soldier happened to be born in the United States. His people had, by executive order of her husband, been interned, been imprisoned, been thrown into concentration camps during the panic following World War II. Following Pearl Harbor. They were in the greatest loss of civil rights, with the exception of Native Americans, I think, and African Americans. The executive order here was from a person you would have expected never to do this, and Eleanor was horrified. She went when Franklin actually needed her desperately to soothe nerves and to quell violence at one of the 10 concentration camps. This is the Manzanar camp in Arizona, where everything's looking pretty bright and cheery, but it had not been, and it was not bright and cheery. And Eleanor was the one who brought the truth of it to people and brought the hope and general goodwill to people who had been so abandoned by their government. It was hard to believe it was still America. When Franklin died, the world changed, needless to say. It was a moment of national, of international, of global mourning. And Eleanor was dry-eyed through the funeral in a way that moved people. It was part of her own disaffection from the personal side of Franklin at that point. He had been in Warm Springs suffering terribly. But Lucy Mercer had once again been reappearing, and she reappeared at his bedside just before his death. In fact, she learned when she arrived in Warm Springs. And her daughter Anna had been part of the sort of deception, but she knew not to blame Anna. She knew it was Franklin one more time having his way. And by then she knew him and understood him and felt that she loved him for who he really was and could love him. And it's how she loved. She loved people for what they really were, not for what she wanted them to be. She loved in a way that also, of course, was always putting others first. And it was to Harry Truman, as Vice President Truman was brought from the Capitol to the White House and walked in unknowing. And it was Eleanor who greeted him, and she took his hand and she said, "Harry, the president is dead." And he looked stunned, of course, and he said, "Well, what can I do for you?" And she said, no, Harry, what can I do for you? For you're the one who's now in trouble." And you can see this as Truman was sworn in later that day, how in trouble Harry Truman, who didn't even know that America had an atomic bomb program, how in trouble he and his wife and daughter were or felt. The people of the United States felt like they were in trouble. Their war leader, their person who'd gotten them through the Depression was gone, their father figure. It was national time of national mourning, and Eleanor thought first of Americans when she heard the news, and first of her sons, and she sent them telegrams overseas that their father would want them to continue on. And she thought then of the American people whom she felt very connected to as her train returned famously from Warm Springs. Harry Truman sent Eleanor Roosevelt, and I've got to hurry through these last bits, but sent her overseas as quickly as he could, partly because she was so popular politically. At home, people kept asking her whether she would be president or at least vice president or a senator. And she didn't want to be any of those things. And she told a reporter, "No, the story's over. This was all about my husband. This is not about me." But of course, it was about her, and for a number of reasons. And one of them was that she really was able, in a world that was just ridden with anxiety, as the war ended and as the United States reached its zenith in possession of this device, this atomic bomb that could end life on Earth. People looked to Eleanor Roosevelt as she joined the American delegation to the UN in London, and as she joined all of the questions about how to live in a world and not have a war again, how to find a peace that was going to be real and lasting this time as it had not been after First War, how hundreds of millions of displaced people were going to find homes. They turned to Eleanor Roosevelt because she had a calmness, a persuasiveness, a wisdom, and she began to know how to become a diplomat. And as she did, she fell in love again. A too long story for this point in the evening, but here we have Eleanor with her new love, David Gurovich, her doctor, and she fell in love with David in ways she had never fallen in love before. She pledged herself to him, and as they carried on a really remarkable relationship, he was 18 years younger than she. Eleanor came to the height of her life as a diplomat, getting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document where you have to really agree with pretty much not just your neighbor and someone in Louisiana and someone in Texas and someone in Afghanistan and someone in Norway, what a human being is, but you have to agree with them on what that human should be able to do and what they have the right to do and what you have the right to do because they have the right to do. And it's one of the most astonishing documents if you sit down and really read it, because you just can't believe that this has to be defined this way. But it was so basic and so hard for a universal set of expectations about what humans are and what rights they would live under in this new, anxious, terror-filled world, that really only one person could have done it. And at that point, if you really think about it, and that was Eleanor. And she got the standing ovation no one had ever given, and no one would ever give at the UN for years. And it was passed on December the 10th, 1948. She returned home for Christmas. Christmas with Eleanor Roosevelt was an overwhelming experience to people who loved her. She had started Christmas shopping the January before. I mention this simply because it's one of her characteristics. She cared. She deeply, deeply cared about individuals and people. And it showed, and she overdid it. She totally overdid it. She indulged people. She overdid it with David Gurevich. And she finally moved in, not just with David, but with David and his wife. And she moved into this place on East 74th Street, 55, a townhouse she bought with money that she had gotten from an oleomargarine ad and given some of it to charity, but she kept some to buy this house that my daughter Diana was game enough to stand outside of when I needed to take a photograph of it when she long ago was a schoolgirl in New York City. Eleanor had a babushka quality, or as I think of it that way. You can sort of see her here with Mrs. Khrushchev and with Premier Khrushchev. Really kind of, well, she knew the Russians and she knew how to get along with them. And I think it was one of her greatest achievements was knowing how to deal with the Soviets when she had to deal with them and how to get what she wanted and how to give them what they wanted. And we really could use her today. She went everywhere continuously. She never stopped. She never paused. David became her constant companion. He was all for her going out and doing all those things, but he also began noticing in 1960 that she had a blood condition. She didn't stop her. She was the doyen of the Democratic Party. She went to every single meeting. She jumped on this is her giving the speech at the keynote speech at the Democratic Convention 1960 that nominated Jack Kennedy, a whole other story. But she would jump on in 1961 the flatbed truck that a new young progressive politician named Ed Koch was trying to become one of the new progressives taking over New York. She never stopped. She never tired. She did realize she was getting older and she really didn't want to live a life that was not the life of Eleanor Roosevelt. And she made a deal with David that stems from one of her childhood fears about being buried alive. She actually, they signed a document where he would, as her doctor, make sure that when she died, he would strip her veins. He would make sure she would not be buried prematurely. But what really happened was that he discovered that very slowly and in a very tormented kind of way, tormented because she didn't want any more intervention. She had really made up her mind about her end of life and she did not want to have excessive intervention. She wanted to die peacefully. He, of course, a doctor in pioneering and originally in polio, but he was her personal physician by her choice, and he wanted to save her, and that was his job. And they went through months and months of real pain, real torment over hospitalizations, over tests, finally realizing it was tuberculosis that was incurable. He never stopped trying to save her, and she never stopped trying to die on her own terms. When she finally died in November of 1962, Eleanor Roosevelt was buried in Hyde Park, New York, at a funeral that was attended by 4 presidents of the United States, 3 first ladies, a justice of the Chief Justice of the United States, and governors and senators, and on and on. It was, the newspapers quoted one of the clergymen at her funeral who said, "We were now one world orphaned by her loss." And in so many ways, that is really what, the orphaning of Eleanor Roosevelt is partly the story of her suffering. I think that what she was is something that will never be again. There's no career as Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a completely unique person. Her courage, her humor, her intelligence, her wisdom, her ability to seek through her own pain and the pain of others, global solutions, is America at its most noble and will remain that way. She was buried finally in her mother-in-law's rose garden, a strange, odd place, just next to Franklin, as you see there, both of their graves covered in ivy. The two of them carrying on in their river world there forward in a way when people arrive there and stand there, you see them not in positions of mourning, but they kind of come alive when they enter the rose garden. And so that's how I always think of Eleanor, especially when I go there, and it's always a very moving experience, is it's of life. It's not really a place of death at all. It's a place of living, a living person, a living spirit. And that's my Eleanor Roosevelt.
David, thank you so much for an absolutely incredible program tonight. We've reached our ordinarily sacrosanct cutoff time of 7 p.m. However, I think we'll do 3 questions. I've got one from the chat room and then 2 that had been sent to me during the chat room. The first from the chat room is, would you talk to us about Mrs. Roosevelt's influence on the civil rights movement?
Yes, I think Eleanor's greatest influence was being the friend in the White House that had certainly never been there before and that wasn't there for years afterward. And uniquely, she brought into the White House African Americans, Black Americans who were struggling on the front lines of the struggle. She became a director of the NAACP. Certain events happened in 1938, famously in Birmingham, Alabama, at a meeting that was very high tone, very, very intellectual, lots of Southern educators, people from around the country, all were gathering to figure out how the South could do a better job being the South, I guess is essentially what it was. Bull Connor, later to reappear in the 60s era of civil rights struggle, was then a young man and with his Black Mariah police van surrounded the hall in Birmingham and declared that anyone in this unlawful meeting, it was unlawful for Blacks and whites to meet together and be in a room like the auditorium, that anyone there would be arrested. And as a line was literally, a string was literally drawn down the middle of the meeting to indicate which side was white and which side was Black, Eleanor Roosevelt put her chair right in the middle, sat in the middle and folded her arms and said, this is where I'm sitting. And she joined Black and white in spirit, more I would say than in actual triumphs and successes. The civil rights movement of the 1940s was probably 1 step forward, 3 steps back. She often had to warn leaders against bringing 100,000 sleeping car porters to Washington because it would do more harm than good. She was constantly frustrating younger Black leaders as time went on into the 50s by saying the same kinds of things. Had she lived past 62, she would have collided with Malcolm X. She would have collided. There would have been collisions of all kinds historically. But in her time, in her place, she was doing things that no other white leader was doing. And she did things like called to going to attend a meeting where she was warned off the meeting and where a bounty was put on her head by the Ku Klux Klan. She went to the meeting anyway in the South. She constantly was challenging the order, the standing order, and she was really instrumental in bringing African Americans into the Democratic Party. That may not have been the greatest thing in the end politically, but it certainly brought the struggle along that much farther than had things remained the same. She was a figure of change, but I would say not she certainly wasn't a figure of revolution or of revolutionary change. She was subversive in her way, but also a figure of the, I mean, what Eleanor Roosevelt's democracy was the democracy of reciprocity, the democracy not of institutions balancing themselves, but of human beings. And she sought dignity, and she sought the dignity of African Americans by white Americans, and how you and I would treat each other and how you and I would treat our neighbors.
Got it. Now, two more. Here's one. The role of First Lady has evolved over the last century, but certainly Mrs. Roosevelt was the true break with the past. Do any of her successors, I could say predecessors, but we'll leave Abigail Adams out. But do any of her successors compare with her in influence or her ability to provoke and stir up controversy?
Wait, was the first part compared to her in what?
Do any of her successors compare with her in influence or in her ability to provoke controversy?
Yeah, there seems to be no end of potential controversy in that job. Certainly, Michelle Obama was able to do that without doing much, without hardly by simply wearing a shorter sleeve dress. And Lord knows we've just been through something that barely merits attention in a world that should care, and that Eleanor taught us should care and was herself literally caring. I think she was a figure of influence unlike any other from 1932 on. And that's partly because she was in the job longest. And as the First Lady of the United States, who presides the wrong word, who made the individual the lesson of the Depression, and who made the GI the lesson of the Second World War for Americans at any rate, and our freedoms, and as a soldier of freedom herself, literally, she would be bound to have more influence than almost, and I don't think there's another First Lady who had the opportunities. And I think many of them would identify her as a model or one of their chief models for sure. You hear it all the time, both Republican and Democrat. I don't think there's any partisanship in that job when people think of how Eleanor was in it. She certainly keeps topping those lists. And she herself, of course, would tell you, no, no, no. And, you know, if I'm remembered for anything, I hope I'm remembered happily. But if I can't be remembered that way, then I don't want to be remembered at all.
This is the last question for this evening. It is hard in a biography of a much loved figure to also convey how deeply hated she was. Can you discuss the anti-Eleanor camp, and how much of this would you ascribe to misogyny? What so offended them?
Well, what so offended them was that she was so effective. And I think when you saw her ability to move people, literally move them, to make them never forget the moment that she had said something or done something, that it became part of their personal history. I mean, one of the things Eleanor Roosevelt is famous for saying is, we all make our own history. And I think people felt that when they were with her and around her and inspired by her, that they were now making their own history. If you think of one of the craziest ideas about Eleanor Roosevelt, for instance, and one of those was in the South. I'm sorry to pick on the South, but because there was some really crazy stuff in the North, and really crazy stuff coming from women, by the way. The women really disliked her because she wasn't doing what women they thought were supposed to do, which was take care of her husband. And she took actually terrific care of FDR in certain ways. In other ways, that's another story. But she was not the wife that women wanted a wife to be. In some women, the club women, the sort of the women who would whose husbands were going to golf courses that had bunkers named Eleanor's Teeth because it had 4, 5, or 6 sand traps. But what Eleanor's power, I think this is the important part of this question, is about why she was so hated, and it's really because of how effective she was. When rumors began in the South at one point that Eleanor clubs, they were called, had sprung up, it meant that in households where Black domestic workers were employed, that on a given day, they were all going to walk out at the same time and shove. If they crossed paths with white folks in the street, they were supposed to shove them into the gutter or some such thing. All kinds of nonsense about how an entire conspiracy of Black domestic help was going to act suddenly in unison as an uprising and a conspiratorial force, all at the command of Eleanor Roosevelt, is one of the kinds of conspiracy theories, conspiracy ideas we're seeing right this minute in American politics. But that it should be, imagine if it was all being ascribed to Jill Biden. Well, you can imagine such a thing now, but at the time it was unimaginable that a first lady would ever be able to do that, but people thought that this might be possible. So it kind of gives an idea of the strength of her influence. Her great strength, and I think the greatest lesson of it, is that she never fell for it. And I will draw only one comparison, a not particularly flattering one, to the previous first lady. When people tried to sue Eleanor Roosevelt, when people took their greatest shots at Eleanor, she simply turned the other cheek. She let it go. And she never brought a suit, as the previous first lady did, when she was called names, and she never brought a defamation suit against anybody for calling her a name, and she was called some real doozies. There is no question that she followed a kind of Christian turn the other cheek, parable-like approach to criticism and to slings and arrows, but it went past that. It went into her own core, which is that people are people, and they're going to do those things, and you have to just learn to live with it, and you have to see past them. And she genuinely tried to see the better angels. And I think that's what she kept hoping for and insisting on and asking us to be. She said, live a life of intelligence, live a life of wisdom, be stronger, be honest and truthful, but be joyful in your life. And she meant those things.
I think of the cartoon of coal miners in a mine, and I think one of them says, "Oh my gosh, it's Mrs. Roosevelt," which shows how much she cared and how much she mattered to a nation at a time of great national trouble. David Michaelis, thank you for an absolutely splendid Gertrude Polk Brown lecture. I'd like to thank all of our audience tonight for being with us. What we do, what we put on our programming, how we react to it is fundamental to our American democracy. That's what we're all about. And my hat is off. My gratitude is very, very profound to the descendants of Gertrude Polk Brown for putting these lectures on. Thank you.